Rome, the empire of marble, fire, and blood, an empire where gods were carved into stone and emperors into legends, but some legends are darker than the night. Some echo not with triumph but with whispers of madness, and at the center of one of the darkest chapters of Rome's history stands a man whose name still chills the air: Nero. Imagine this, the emperor of the most powerful empire on earth, draped in purple silk, crowned with gold, watching his reflection flicker in polished bronze. His eyes search not for enemies, not for plots, but for beauty. Beauty he could possess, beauty he could reshape. In his gaze, the empire itself was not enough. Rome's riches, Rome's armies, Rome's gods, none could satisfy him. He wanted something more forbidden, more grotesque. This is not the story of Nero's burning of Rome, though that is the tale most remember. This is the story of a young boy, a slave plucked from obscurity, who became the object of Nero's deranged desire. A boy whose fate was not to rise but to be broken, moulded, and remade, not into a man, but into something Nero called his wife. Yes, this is the story of how Nero, emperor of Rome, took a boy, castrated him, dressed him in silks, and forced him to play the role of his bride before the eyes of the empire, and the boy's name was Sporus. As you listen, ask yourself, how far can power twist the human soul? How deep can obsession corrode morality until nothing remains but spectacle and cruelty? And what happens when the man who holds the world in his hand is consumed not by duty, but by desire? Stay with me until the very end, because this story is not what you think. It is stranger, it is more tragic, and buried inside it is a lesson that Rome ignored, but we cannot. But before we descend fully into Nero's madness, I want to ask you something. Look at the time right now. What time is it where you are, and where are you watching from? Drop your answer in the comments below. I want to see just how far across the world this story reaches. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, because the stories I tell here are the stories the world wants you to forget. Now, let's begin where all dark legends begin, not with the horror itself, but with the promise of greatness that quickly curdles into ruin. To understand the nightmare of Sporus, we must first understand the man who crafted it, the emperor who believed Rome was nothing more than a stage, and its people nothing more than actors in his deranged performance. Nero was not born to cruelty, he was born to promise, and like so many great tragedies, that promise burned brightly before it turned to ash. The boy who would one day be emperor entered the world in the year 37 AD, born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. His family line was tangled in the blood-soaked roots of Rome's ruling elite. His father, notorious for cruelty, died young, leaving behind a boy with flame-colored hair and sharp, searching eyes. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was a woman of ambition so fierce it was said she would climb over the corpses of her kin to reach power. And in truth she did. Rome at this time was a beast gnawing at itself. The empire was vast, too vast, stretching from Britain's cold shores to Egypt's golden sands. It was rich, decadent, unstable. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, heirs of Julius Caesar and Augustus, ruled with iron and intrigue. And within that world of poison and daggers, young Lucius, Nero, was pushed forward like a pawn. Agrippina knew her son was her ticket back to the throne. She married Emperor Claudius, her own uncle, and maneuvered Nero into the line of succession, shoving aside rivals. Claudius, weak and aging, adopted the boy, giving him a new name, Nero Claudius Caesar. Suddenly, a boy with no future was heir to the greatest empire on earth. When Claudius mysteriously died in 54 AD, whispers say poisoned by Agrippina's hand, Nero, barely 17, was crowned emperor. Imagine that. A teenager draped in purple commanding armies, sitting atop centuries of power. The city erupted in celebration. Statues were raised, oaths sworn. Rome, weary of old rulers, saw in Nero something fresh, something golden. And at first Nero did not disappoint. He cut taxes, he ended secret trials, he gave lavish games to the people, filling the Colosseum with spectacle. He spoke not with the stiffness of an emperor, but with the flair of an actor, winning crowds with ease. Poets praised him, citizens adored him. In those first years he was hailed as the dawn of a new age. But light breeds shadows. Behind the curtain of applause, Agrippina's influence loomed. She was the power behind the throne, whispering in her son's ear, reminding him of the crown she had carved from blood for him. At first, Nero bent to her will, but he was not a boy who would tolerate a leash for long. He loved music, theatre, and performance. He saw himself not as a ruler, but as an artist. The empire to him was less a burden and more an audience. Conflict came quickly. Agrippina demanded obedience. Nero craved freedom. He fell in love with a freed woman, Acte, a romance his mother scorned. He longed to sing and perform in public, something considered disgraceful for a ruler. Each step he took away from her control, Agrippina pushed back harder, until the bond between mother and son cracked, then shattered. By the year 59 AD, the boy who once glowed with promise had blood on his hands. Nero ordered his mother's death. The details remain blurred by rumor, but the story Rome tells is chilling. Agrippina was invited to a feast by the sea. A boat was prepared for her, rigged to collapse and drown her. When she swam to shore and survived, assassins were sent to finish the task. Struck down in her villa, her own son's command sealed her fate. It was then the mask slipped. The Rome that had once adored Nero now began to whisper. But Nero did not falter. He plunged headlong into indulgence. He built golden palaces, staged endless games, and performed songs on lyres as if he were Apollo himself reborn. He was emperor, but more than that, he wanted to be adored, not for conquest, but for beauty. And beauty, in Nero's mind, was fragile, fleeting, something he must grasp, control, and never lose again. That desire curdled into obsession when he found Poppaea Sabina. Unlike the plain Acte, Poppaea was radiant, ambitious, and cunning. She became his empress, his muse, the woman for whom he would tear down laws and spill rivers of blood. But love under Nero was never gentle. In a fit of rage, he struck her, and she fell, pregnant, her life extinguished at his hand. From that moment, Nero's descent into madness accelerated. He had killed his mother, killed his wife, and yet their ghosts lingered in him. Rome whispered that the emperor had lost himself, that he was searching for what he destroyed. And it is here, in this pit of grief and obsession, that Sporus enters the story. For when Nero looked at the boy, he did not see a slave. He saw Poppaea, her face, her youth, her delicate beauty, and in the twisted theatre of his mind, he decided he could bring her back. But to do so, he would have to destroy the boy and remake him into something he was not. This is the promise of power turned sour, a boy emperor who began as a beacon of hope, now a tyrant consumed by desire. And it is within this transformation that the cruelest act of all was born. In the next part, we step into Nero's rise to absolute control, the moment when his hunger for performance consumed not only himself, but the empire that adored him, and you will see how the seeds of Sporus's fate were planted long before the boy was ever chosen. Rome had seen emperors before, soldiers, conquerors, politicians, tyrants, but never had it seen one like Nero. He was not a commander of legions, not a builder of empires. He was a performer, and to him the empire itself was not a burden to govern, but a theatre in which he could star. Imagine the young emperor stepping onto a stage lit by torches, the marble halls filled with senators in white togas, their golden rings flashing in the firelight, the air heavy with incense, and there, in the centre, Nero, crowned not with laurel but with the silence of thousands waiting for him to speak. He did not speak of laws or wars. He sang, he played the lyre, his voice filled the chamber, trembling with passion. To Rome's elite, it was humiliating, disgraceful. An emperor was not meant to perform, but to the masses, the common people, the ones who filled the circuses and drank cheap wine in taverns, Nero was dazzling. They cheered for him not as a ruler but as a god of art. He gave them bread, games, music. He poured gold into spectacles that defied imagination. Gladiators fought under ceilings of painted stars. Wild beasts from Africa were unleashed for slaughter. Actors recited tragedies while Nero himself took the stage in costumes of heroes and gods. Rome had become his theatre, and the citizens his audience. Yet behind the applause, the empire groaned. Taxes soared. Provinces were bled dry to feed the emperor's endless hunger for performance. Senators gritted their teeth as their dignity was mocked. Generals muttered in shadows as Rome's military might was neglected for music. But no one dared to defy him, because in Nero's Rome, loyalty was enforced not by love but by fear. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers, encircled him like wolves. His advisors, men like Tigellinus, whispered in his ear, feeding his whims, silencing dissent with daggers and poison. One by one, rivals disappeared, exiled, executed, erased. Nero's power grew absolute, but so too did his paranoia. Then came the fire, the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Flames devoured the city for days, reducing temples, homes and markets to ash. The people wept, homeless and starving, and in the smoke rumors spread like sparks. Nero had ordered it. Some claimed he wanted to clear land for his golden house, the Domus Aurea, a palace so extravagant it would glisten with gold leaf, pools and marble halls larger than entire cities. Others swore they saw him standing on a balcony as the flames roared, plucking his lyre, singing of the fall of Troy as Rome itself burned. Truth or rumour, it did not matter. The people believed, and belief is often deadlier than fact. To save himself, Nero cast blame elsewhere, on the Christians, a strange and growing sect despised by Rome. He ordered them seized, tortured, burned alive in gardens as human torches to light his feasts. The crowds gasped, half horrified, half entertained. Once again, Rome became a stage of cruelty, and Nero its director. But the fire left scars. Beneath the applause, resentment grew. The senators seethed. The people murmured. The empire trembled under the weight of one man's obsession with spectacle. And Nero, sensing the whispers, turned ever more inward, seeking beauty, seeking love, seeking control. It was during this descent that his fixation deepened. Poppaea Sabina, his empress, the jewel of his court, the woman whose beauty he had idolized, was gone, killed by his own hand in a rage. Her absence left a void no theatre, no palace, no empire could fill. Nero was haunted, and like all men haunted, he sought a ghost to chase. The empire watched as he grew stranger. He dressed as women in private feasts. He demanded to be called not just emperor but artist, hero, god. He had statues carved of himself as Apollo, as Hercules, as Sol the sun god. Each performance blurred the line between ruler and actor, between reality and fantasy. And then came the whispers of Sporus. A boy, delicate, beautiful, with features so hauntingly similar to the dead Poppaea that those who saw him could not help but stare. In the crowded palace halls, where eunuchs and slaves scurried like shadows, Nero's gaze fixed on the boy. He was not a soldier, not a senator, not a noble. He was nothing. And yet, in that nothing, Nero saw everything. The rise of Nero was not just the story of an emperor claiming power. It was the story of a man drowning in his own desires, a man who no longer knew where art ended and life began. And in that blur, in that madness, he reached for Sporus, not as a boy, not as a person, but as a canvas upon which he could paint his fantasy. Rome itself had risen under him, only to watch its emperor rise into a dream that would soon curdle into a nightmare. For the higher Nero climbed in his theatre of power, the more brutal the fall would be, not only for him, but for the boy who would become his most tragic creation. In the next chapter we will step into the heart of obsession. You will see how Sporus became more than a shadow in Nero's court, how he became the emperor's obsession, and how that obsession turned into one of the most grotesque transformations in high story. Obsession never begins with thunder. It begins with a glance, a pause, a moment when one soul fixates upon another, not out of reason but out of hunger. For Nero, that moment came when his eyes fell upon Sporus. The boy was not a soldier, not a senator, not even a man of noble birth. He was a slave, born in obscurity, meant to serve, meant to be forgotten. His face was delicate, his voice soft, his movements graceful in ways that set him apart from the others who scurried through the gilded halls of the imperial palace. But in those features, slight, almost feminine, Nero saw something more. He saw a ghost, Poppaea Sabina, his empress, his lover, the woman he had adored with a passion that burned so hot it consumed her life. She had been the one to captivate him, the one whose beauty seemed divine. But in a fit of rage, he had struck her down, leaving her lifeless on the floor, her unborn child lost with her. Her absence gnawed at him, a wound that refused to close. Rome's poets whispered that he was tormented by her memory, that he wept in solitude, that he cursed the gods for taking her. But Nero's grief was not ordinary. It was twisted, poisonous. And then, Sporus. To the emperor, the boy looked like Poppaea reborn. The curve of his cheek, the softness of his eyes, the youthful grace of his form. It was as if fate had given Nero a chance to undo the past, to resurrect what he himself had destroyed. But Nero was not a man who begged favors from fate. He was a man who bent reality until it broke. He began by drawing Sporus closer. The boy who once swept halls and poured wine was suddenly summoned to the emperor's chambers. At first, whispers spread only among slaves. Then the court noticed. The emperor's gaze lingered too long. His voice softened when he spoke the boy's name. Senators raised their brows. Soldiers smirked behind their helmets, but no one dared lag. Aloud, for in Rome to mock the emperor's desire was to invite death. As the weeks passed, the line between grief and obsession dissolved. Nero began dressing Sporus in fine clothes, silks embroidered with gold, jewelry fit for a queen. He commanded him to wear makeup, to soften his features further. Step by step, the boy was being reshaped, molded, not into who he was, but into who Nero demanded him to be. Imagine the terror of it. You are young, powerless, a slave in the most dangerous court in the world. The emperor himself, violent, unpredictable, cruel, fixes his eyes on you. You cannot refuse him. You cannot run. Your fate is sealed by the flicker of his desire. Every day, Sporus woke not knowing whether he was to be caressed like a treasure or destroyed like a toy. And then came the moment that sealed his fate. Nero's grief, his obsession, reached its breaking point. He decided that Sporus would not simply resemble Poppaea, he would become her, entirely. It was an idea born not of love but of madness. If Sporus was to be Poppaea, he could not be a man. He must be stripped of his body, of his manhood, of his future. And so Nero gave the order that shocked even the most decadent corners of Rome. The boy was to be castrated. Picture it, a boy led into the shadows of the palace, trembling, perhaps not even fully understanding what awaited him. Held down as blades did their work, his body altered forever. His cries muffled by the walls of power, unheard by a city that would never know his suffering, only his new role. When he emerged, he was no longer Sporus the boy. He was Sporus, the emperor's wife. The court was stunned. Some sneered in disgust, others laughed in whispers, but none dared challenge him. Nero staged it not as cruelty but as ceremony. He paraded Sporus before the palace, clothed in the gowns of Poppaea, adorned with jewels, his hair styled as a queen's. He even held a wedding, yes, a wedding, with Rome's court as witnessed. Where the emperor of Rome took a boy as his bride. The empire gasped, but it obeyed. The senators bowed, the soldiers saluted, the people whispered in taverns, yet they cheered when ordered. Rome had become Nero's theatre, and Sporus was cast into the role of Poppaea, forced to play it until the end. But obsession is never satisfied. For Nero, this was not enough. Dressing Sporus as Poppaea did not heal the wound, it only deepened the madness. He began treating him as if he truly were her reborn. He kissed him in public, called him empress, and forced the empire to acknowledge the illusion. For Nero, it was not a game, it was reality. And what of Sporus? His voice is lost to history. We do not know his thoughts, his feelings, his terror, but we can imagine. Imagine the weight of living not as yourself but as someone else's ghost. Imagine being paraded before thousands, knowing they all saw you not for who you were, but for who you were forced to become. It was not life, it was theatre, and in this theatre the boy was both actor and prisoner. The empire stood silent. Perhaps some pitied him, perhaps some mocked him, but none could save him. For who could save anyone from the emperor of Rome? This was Nero's obsession, to defy death, to rewrite reality, to force the world to bend to his desire. But obsession, once it takes root, is never still. It demands more, it demands spectacle, and soon Nero would give it exactly that. In the next chapter, you will see how this obsession erupted into public display, how Nero's hunger for control transformed not only Sporus but the empire itself into a stage of cruelty and awe. Every tragedy has a moment when it shifts, when desire becomes action, when whispers become spectacle. For Nero and Sporus, that moment came not in silence, but in ceremony. The emperor of Rome decided that grief was not enough, desire was not enough. Truly reclaim what he had lost, he would turn obsession into ritual, he would wed the boy. The news rippled through the palace like fire through dry reeds. At first, many thought it was a rumor, a dark jest whispered by drunk senators. But it was no joke. Invitations were sent, priests were summoned, a wedding was to be held, not between emperor and empress, not between man and woman, but between the ruler of the world and a boy mutilated into the shape of his obsession. The day arrived with all the grandeur of Rome's ceremonies. Imagine it, the forum alive with music, incense curling into the air, trumpets blaring. Senators draped in white togas filed into place, their faces stiff with forced composure. The Praetorian Guard stood watch, their armor gleaming like fire in the sun, and there in the center was Nero, adorned in imperial purple, his head crowned with a golden wreath. Beside him, trembling yet silent, was Sporus, dressed not as a man, but as a bride. His gown shimmered with pearls, a veil thin as smoke draped across his face. He was no longer himself, he was the shadow of Poppaea, resurrected by cruelty. The vows were spoken, the priests blessed the union, the emperor kissed his bride before the eyes of Rome, and the empire gasped in silence. Senators exchanged glances, soldiers tightened their jaws, the people muttered in taverns, but no one stopped it, no one dared. This was the catalyst, the moment Nero shattered the line between private madness and public obscenity. By making Sporus his wife, he forced Rome itself to participate in his delusion. Every senator who bowed, every priest who blessed, every soldier who saluted became part of the grotesque theatre. They could not look away, and they could not refuse. The emperor had declared reality, and reality obeyed. But it was not enough for Nero to wed the boy. He wanted the world to believe in the illusion. He paraded Sporus through the city as if he were truly Empress Poppaea reborn. They rode stars, together in litters of gold, cheered by crowds compelled to smile. At feasts, Sporus sat beside him, jewelled and perfumed, introduced as my wife. Even in private, Nero demanded he be addressed as lady, as empress. And what of Sporus? His silence is the loudest part of this story. No words of his survive, no record of his thoughts or resistance. He is remembered only as Nero's creation, not as himself. But in that silence we can imagine the weight of humiliation, the terror of existing not as a person but as a ghost, a performance without end. Yet even this was not enough to satisfy Nero's hunger. His obsession fed upon itself, spiraling deeper. He had turned the boy into a wife, but now he dreamed of turning the world into his stage. He began performing in public, not only as emperor, but as actor, singer, and dancer. He forced Rome's elite to sit through endless performances where he strutted in costumes, sang tragedies, and played heroes. To leave before the end was treason. To yawn was death. The emperor demanded applause, and applause thundered whether from admiration or fear. And everywhere he went, Sporus followed, an ornament of obsession, the proof of Nero's power to defy nature itself. When he sang of lost love, Sporus sat in sight. When he played the role of gods, Sporus glittered at his side. The boy became the living symbol of the emperor's madness, displayed like a trophy. But Rome was beginning to crack. Senators humiliated by his excess, generals enraged by his neglect of war, citizens crushed by his taxes and extravagance. The empire that had once cheered him now murmured against him. Plots brewed in shadows, daggers gleamed in silence, and yet Nero could not see it. He was blinded not by politics or duty, but by obsession. The catalyst was not only the wedding of Sporus, it was the message it sent, that there was no limit to Nero's will. If he wished to rewrite nature, he would. If he wished to bend Rome itself into a grotesque performance, he would, and no one could stop him. But history has a way of punishing arrogance. The empire Nero believed he owned was already slipping from his hands. The fire of resentment spread just as the Great Fire had devoured the city years before, and soon Rome would turn on its emperor. Yet before the fall, there would be spectacle. Spectacle so grotesque and unforgettable that even centuries later, the name Sporus would still echo as a symbol of cruelty and madness. In the next chapter, we descend into the transformation itself, the moment when Nero's obsession reached its most horrifying peak, and the boy was forced into a role that would define him for eternity. Rome was no stranger to spectacle. Gladiators clashed in the sands of the amphitheatre. Generals paraded their victories in glittering triumphs. Even death itself was turned into entertainment, with criminals thrown to beasts as crowds roared for blood. But what Nero crafted with Sporus was no ordinary spectacle. It was not about war or empire or even politics. It was about obsession put on stage. It was about grief dressed in jewels. It was about an emperor forcing the world to bow to his fantasy. The transformation of Sporus had been brutal, but it was in the spectacle that his suffering became Rome's theatre. The city watched as a boy, robbed of his manhood, veiled like a bride, was paraded as Poppia reborn, and Nero was not content with whispers in the palace. He wanted Rome to see, he wanted Rome to applaud, he wanted his madness to be celebrated as glory. Imagine the streets lined with citizens, torches flickering against the twilight sky, the sound of trumpets announcing the approach of the emperor. And then there he was, Nero, draped in purple, his face lit with manic triumph. But at his side, beneath a veil of silk, walked Sporus, adorned in golden embroidery, his face powdered, his lips painted, his body swaying beneath the weight of a costume that was not his own. The crowd gasped, some laughed, some whispered, some remained silent, their expressions frozen with fear. And then Nero spoke the words that turned the procession into a nightmare. He introduced Sporus as his wife, as Lady Poppea. Senators bowed, priests blessed, soldiers saluted, and the people, whether out of fear or madness, cheered. The illusion was complete. The emperor's will had become Rome's reality. But this was not the only spectacle. There were dinners staged like plays where Sporus was made to sit beside Nero in the place once reserved for an empress. Guests were forced to toast to the couple, to raise cups of wine as if celebrating a sacred union. The air was thick with unease, yet no one dared speak against it. To question Nero was to invite death. To laugh at the charade was to risk execution. So they played along. They clapped, they smiled, they acted. Rome itself became Nero's stage, and there was more. Nero delighted in presenting Sporus before foreign guests, ambassadors and kings. He paraded him not just as a wife, but as proof that Rome's emperor could defy even the laws of nature. In one chilling account, Nero staged a mock wedding feast before dignitaries, complete with dowry, vows, and a bridal veil. Sporus, silent and trembling, was kissed before the crowd as Nero declared him his eternal bride. The hall erupted with forced applause, but beneath the noise lurked unease, disgust, and fear. What did Sporus feel in these moments? History gives us no words from his lips, but we can imagine the torment. Every step, every glance, every forced smile must have felt like another wound. To be kissed before thousands, not as yourself, but as a mask for another's obsession, this is a cruelty beyond comprehension. The spectacle was not just humiliation, it was erasure, repeated endlessly, until the boy beneath the veil disappeared into silence. And yet there was a deeper tragedy. For all the spectacle, for all the pomp and cruelty, Nero was not satisfied. The applause never filled the void, the laughter never erased the memory of Poppaea's death. The sight of Sporus in silks could not silence the ghost that haunted him. Each spectacle was louder, grander, more grotesque, because Nero was trying to drown out something he could never escape, his own guilt. But the empire was watching. Senators who once feared him now whispered in private. Generals mocked him behind closed doors. Citizens grew restless. The spectacle that was meant to glorify Nero only exposed his madness, and with each performance the seeds of his downfall were sown. Still, in those years Rome endured the sight of Sporus paraded as empress, a living reminder of the emperor's cruelty, and the boy endured it all in silence. He became the unwilling centerpiece of a theatre that the world could not look away from, a symbol of what happens when absolute power is married to absolute obsession. The spectacle was grotesque, yes, but it was also fragile. For the empire was beginning to crack. Rebellions stirred, enemies gathered, the people's patience thinned, and soon the curtain would fall, not only on Nero's performance, but on Nero himself. But what would happen to Sporus when the applause ended? When the emperor who had destroyed him was destroyed in turn? That question would soon become the cruelest twist of all. For years Nero had played emperor as if it were theatre, turning Rome into his stage and its people into his audience. But every performance must end, and the greater the spectacle, the louder the silence that follows. By the year 68 CE, Rome's patience had snapped. Armies in distant provinces revolted. Generals once loyal now raised banners of rebellion, and in the streets of the capital, whispers grew into shouts. Nero must fall. The empire that had bowed to his illusions was crumbling around him. Provinces bled with unrest. The Senate, once cowed by fear, sharpened its knives. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, began to doubt him, and in the palace Nero himself unraveled. His voice shook in speeches, his hands trembled at banquets. He paced marble halls, muttering to shadows, seeing betrayal in every corner. But still, by his side, veiled and silent, was Sporus. The boy-turned-empress once paraded in silks, now walked in the fading light of a doomed reign. Imagine him there, standing behind Nero as the emperor raved about conspiracies and ghosts, still painted and perfumed, still forced to wear the mask of Poppaea. Even as Rome collapsed, the cruelty did not end. Sporus's suffering was chained to Nero's descent. The fall began with fire, not literal fire this time, but rebellion. In Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex raised his sword against the emperor. In Spain, Galba declared himself rightful ruler. Armies in Africa and Egypt murmured against Nero's name. For the first time, Nero's theatrics could not command loyalty. The empire was too vast, its wounds too deep, and in Rome the Senate struck. They declared Nero a public enemy, stripping him of titles, condemning him to death by beating, a shameful end for an emperor. The Praetorian Guard, smelling blood, abandoned him. The people who once cheered his spectacles now cursed his name. Nero, a man who had commanded Rome, was suddenly alone. Imagine the scene in his palace that final night. The golden halls, once filled with music and laughter, now echo with silence. Statues of gods loom in the flickering torchlight. Doors, once guarded, now hang open, deserted by soldiers who had fled. And in a corner, Nero sits trembling, clutching his throat, whispering, "What an artist dies in me." But even in his final moments he did not face the end alone. At his side was Sporus. The boy he had mutilated, dressed in silks, paraded before Rome, was forced to witness the emperor's collapse. What did Sporus feel as he watched the man who destroyed his life sink into madness? Relief, hatred, terror. Silence hides his truth, but the image lingers. Sporus, veiled and painted, standing in the ruins of power. Nero begged for loyalty, but no one came. He begged for mercy, but none remained. The Senate's soldiers closed in. And so, in a villa outside the city, the Emperor of Rome prepared to end his own life. His hands shook too violently to hold the blade. He looked to his freedman, Epaphroditus, to guide it, and with a final gasp, Nero drove steel into his throat. Blood spilled across the marble. The artist was gone. The tyrant was dead. Rome exhaled, but for Sporus there was no freedom in this moment. He was not released with Nero's death. He was not restored to himself. Instead, he was passed on, like a relic, from one master to another. For the men who seized power after Nero saw in Sporus not a victim, but a trophy. It is here that the story becomes almost unbearable. The boy who had been mutilated and paraded was not allowed to fade into obscurity. Instead, he became a symbol, used, displayed, humiliated, by those who sought to remind Rome of Nero's madness. Sporus, the unwilling bride of an emperor, now stood in the hands of new masters, each eager to twist his suffering for their own ends. The fall of Nero was not the fall of Sporus's torment. It was only a shift in its shape. The boy was still dressed in silks, still called Empress, still haunted by the name Poppaea. He had survived the emperor, but survival did not mean freedom. The empire had rid itself of Nero, but not of cruelty, and for Sporus, the nightmare continued. In the next chapter we enter the aftermath, the cruel fate that awaited the boy in the years after Nero's death, when Rome's new rulers turned his suffering into a political weapon, a grotesque reminder of what power can do when stripped of all humanity. The tyrant was gone, Rome had rid itself of Nero, and the city breathed a sigh of relief. But for Sporus, the boy who had been mutilated, dressed in silks, and forced into a grotesque marriage, Nero's death did not bring freedom. If anything, it made his existence more precarious, for now he was not simply a victim, he was a symbol. And symbols in Rome were never left to rest. They were used, paraded, and exploited until nothing remained. In the months after Nero's fall, chaos reigned. It was the infamous Year of the Four Emperors, when Rome devoured itself in civil war. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian all fought to seize the throne. And in that storm, Sporus was passed from one set of hands to another, like a living relic of Nero's madness. It began with Otho, the man who seized power after Galba's bloody death. Otho knew Nero well. He had once been a friend, even sharing in the emperor's indulgences before falling out of favor. And when he looked upon Sporus, he saw not a broken boy, but an opportunity. He took Sporus for himself, not as a servant, but once again as a wife. Draped again in jewels, veiled again in silk, Sporus was paraded through Rome at Otho's side, a grotesque continuation of the charade Nero had begun. But why? Why would Otho resurrect such a humiliation? The answer was power. By displaying Sporus, Otho reminded Rome of his closeness to Nero, playing upon the nostalgia of those who still longed for the dead emperor. For in Rome, cruelty could be turned into currency, and Sporus, against his will, became that coin. Imagine his despair. To survive Nero only to be forced into the same role under another man, to walk again in the streets of Rome veiled as Poppaea, hearing the laughter, the whispers, the applause commanded by fear. Each day must have felt like the repetition of a nightmare from which there was no waking. But Otho's reign was brief. Within months he faced Vitellius in battle. Defeated, he took his own life, and Sporus once again was left in limbo, awaiting the cruelty of his next master. It did not take long. Vitellius, Rome's new emperor, seized him almost immediately, and Vitellius's use of Sporus was even darker. For Vitellius was not content to parade him as an empress. No, he devised something far more cruel. According to one account, Vitellius planned to reenact the brutal rape of Proserpina, a myth in which the goddess of spring was dragged into the underworld by Pluto. And who would play the goddess in this grotesque performance? Sporus. Dressed once again as a bride, he was to be publicly violated before the eyes of Rome, his torment turned into entertainment. Think about that for a moment. To be stripped of your body, your name, your future, to be forced into marriage with one emperor, to be paraded as a trophy by another, and finally to be condemned to serve as the centerpiece of a staged rape for the amusement of the empire. It is almost beyond comprehension, but that was the fate awaiting Sporus under Vitellius. And here, finally, the boy broke. The silence that had carried him through years of torment shattered. Faced with the prospect of being publicly humiliated, his body desecrated once more before the jeering crowds of Rome, Sporus made his choice. He would not endure it. He would not play their game again. He would not let himself be paraded one final time. So he took his own life. History does not record the details. We do not know where or when or with what means. We know only that he chose death over one last spectacle. The boy who had been mutilated, silenced, dressed, and displayed finally seized one act of agency, refusing to give Rome another performance. And with his death, silence returned. The laughter of the crowds faded. The jeering of Rome fell quiet. The name Sporus vanished from the records of emperors and generals. He was swallowed by history, remembered only in fragments, in whispers, in the margins of chronicles that cared more for Nero than for the boy he destroyed. But if we pause, if we listen closely, the silence itself becomes his voice. A voice that asks, what does power do when unchecked? What cruelty can it justify when no one dares speak against it? And how many Sporus figures, nameless, faceless victims, were lost in the shadows of Rome's glory? The aftermath of Nero's death was not liberation. It was a reminder that the empire itself was complicit, that cruelty did not die with one emperor, but lived on in those who followed. Sporus's fate is not just a story about Nero, it is a story about Rome itself, about an empire that turned human suffering into theatre and applauded as boys were destroyed for spectacle. And yet Sporus's end is not the final note, for even in his silence, even in his erasure, there remains something we must take from his story. Not only the horror, but the lesson. And that lesson, hidden beneath blood and jewels, is what we turn to now. The story of Nero and Sporus is not an easy one to tell. It is not about battles or victories, not about monuments or triumphs. It is about cruelty, the kind of cruelty that hides in the shadows of absolute power, the cruelty that strips away humanity until nothing is left but spectacle. And yet, within this darkness, there is a lesson that demands to be heard. Sporus was never meant to be remembered. To Rome, he was not a person but a prop. He existed only in relation to others, Nero's wife, Otho's trophy, Vitellius's victim. His own voice was erased, his own story silenced. And yet that silence speaks volumes. It tells us that history is not only shaped by those who wield power, but also by those who suffer beneath it. Nero believed he could bend reality to his will. He believed he could mold a boy into a woman, transform grief into spectacle, turn cruelty into love. But in the end, what did it bring him? Betrayal, isolation, death by his own hand. His empire applauded while he forced Sporus into silks. But when the moment came, no one defended him. His performances could not save him from the truth. Power without humanity collapses under its own weight. And what of Sporus? He chose death rather than one final humiliation. Some may see only tragedy in that choice, but there is also defiance. In the end, he refused to give Rome another show. He refused to let his body, his silence, be turned into entertainment once more. It was the only choice left to him, the only way to reclaim the humanity stolen from him. That is the lesson buried in this story, that silence, complicity, and unchecked power breed horrors, that cruelty, when applauded, only grows bolder, and that when we forget the victims, when we erase the Sporuses of history, we risk letting their suffering repeat in new forms, in new empires, in new ages. Look around. How often do we see people turned into symbols, their humanity stripped away? How often do we see cruelty masked as entertainment, suffering paraded as spectacle? Rome is gone, but its echoes remain, and the story of Sporus warns us of what happens when we look away, when we laugh, when we allow power to redefine reality without question. You, listening now, are part of this lesson, because history is not just about the past, it is about the mirror it holds to our present. Ask yourself, in your world, who are the Sporuses? Whose voices are silenced? Whose suffering is turned into theatre? And what will you do? Will you watch in silence, or will you speak? If there is one thing we must carry from this story, it is empathy, the ability to see the humanity of those whom power seeks to erase, to remember the names the world tries to forget, to speak their stories not as curiosities but as warnings. Nero wanted Sporus to vanish into the role of Poppaea, but by telling his story, by saying his name, we resist that erasure. We remind the world that he was more than a symbol, he was a boy, he was human,